Thomas for their contribution to my education and experience since we've met. But I also want to thank folk here at Columbia for allowing us to host this event and this conversation.
Yes.
As already been said, my name is MIKA'IL DeVEAUX, and I usually do not reference any of the number of credentials that I possess to preference any of my conversations, primarily because I don't think it's actually necessary. But I wanted it to be known and clear about the extent of my relationship, both personally and professionally, as we begin this conversation. And so by show of hands, how many of you out there support the institution of slavery? By show of hands. You got it. Let me ask you another question. By show of hands, how many people are in full support of the Constitution of the United States? This is about being honest. How many people out there support the Constitution of the United States? Raise your hand. All right, that's how we're getting somewhere. Because those same hands should have been raised when we talked about supporting the institution of slavery. And this is not a small point, primarily because the Constitution of the law, it functions primarily for the benefit of the citizen. And if we consider ourselves citizens, and this law that we are having a discussion about is something that we support, then we are supporting every aspect of the law which governs our lives. And so I learned about my relationship to the 13th Amendment during the 32 years of time when I was under correctional supervision. 25 of those years I spent actually in prison as a slave of the state, and now as an ex-slave of the state because of my literal reading of the Constitution, because of my literal interpretation of this particular amendment. I was indeed, and I found another way to classify myself, a slave of the state. And it was there that I saw a much broader understanding of my situation, sort of following the George Jackson model of education, the Hajj Malik Malcolm X model of education, where people in prison, some people in prison began to reflect on their current context and sought to gain a better understanding. And what became clear then and what is clear now is that the passing of the amendment in its present form had some but not all of the expected impact for African Americans. There was something that we anticipated following its passage, and it's coincidental that Sheena and I both referenced Frederick Douglass because, for me, Frederick is a hero. And he was one of the persons that I looked to for an example of having the first belief and then the will to reconstruct reality, even though one found himself in a situation that they themselves had not constructed. And so Frederick Douglass, who was more contemporaneously closer to the issue, declared that the 13th Amendment was just the beginning of something. And when I look at the 13th Amendment, I look at it as the beginning of work that is yet unfinished. And Fred, quote, said, "Verily, the work does not end with the abolition of slavery, as stated in the 13th Amendment only began." And some of us who are American citizens, all of us here, should think about the meaning of what it is that Fred was talking about, because the conditions that he articulated still exist. And he said that so long as there were white oppressors, so long as white oppressors retained in their hands power to exclude people of African descent from political rights, they could reduce them to a condition similar to slavery. And this is Fred talking in 1865, May of 1865. They were not called it slavery, but some other name. Slavery had been fruitful in giving itself names. It had been called the peculiar institution. It had been called the social system. It had been called the impediment. It had been called so many names, great many names. Perhaps we might think of another name, immigration detention, as a new name or a new iteration of this social phenomenon. And as you could see with the passage of time, we continue to wait for different iterations of this monster and trying to figure out what other shape it would assume, what new skin this old snake would come forth with. But this is Fred in 1865. I'm just reiterating some of the statements that he made. And so we, in our history, have already seen a number of overt iterations of this form, in the form of convict leasing, in the form of chain gangs, in the form of peonage, in the form of sharecropping. We've seen this before. We also note that, as some would argue, the 13th Amendment was primarily deployed against all of the badges and incidents of slavery. We're still trying to figure out, at least in my mind, some of us are trying to figure out what does that exactly mean. But among the things that is clear that some of the proponents of this amendment sought was an end to a discriminatory system manifested in the black codes, which were directly designed to further enslave blacks by establishing a legal basis for neo-slavery. The black codes were a reconfigured judicial system that included discriminatory laws that would apply primarily to black men only. The intention behind these laws was to criminalize blacks so they could be re-enslaved under a legal system. Sheriffs, deputies, and some court officials derived most of their compensation from fees charged to black people convicted of crimes, each step in their own arrest, conviction, shipment to a private prison. Think of, I think it's Ferguson, wherein people in that particular time were burdened with all kinds of fees that they did not have money to pay, parking fees and all kinds of tickets, and just a way of further dragging people into the system they could not pay. Of course, they were incarcerated. However, the expectation of some was that all the badges and incidents of slavery would be obliterated. This is, what we're thinking that what the 13th Amendment meant. One of the early proponents, Senator Henry Wilson, argued that everything connected with or pertained to it, including the sacred rights of human nature. We would recall that during this time, people of color, particularly African descent, were not even considered human beings. If we understand chattel slavery, we understand that people were things and objects and property. And so among the things that were expected were an acknowledgement of the humanness of the black person. The hallowed relationship of husband and wife. We know during this time that people could not be married unless the slave master permitted the union. We know that, and this is still taking place today, parents and children were, the relationship between parents and children was sacred. We continue to see a separation of parents and children today on our southern borders, reminiscent of the same time period when parents could not protect their children. They were just snatched from them because they could. And so there are a lot of things that are related to the passage of this particular bill that was expected. But if we take in consideration, what is taking place in our own lives, we'll see that there's still bans on practices where minoritized contractors are forbidden from engaging in for their economic gain. We still see admission policies that exclude minoritized groups from select colleges and universities. There's currently a movement in some of the schools' admission process to ban the box, wherein people should not have to mention past incarceration as part of the criteria for their admission. We still see, all types of electoral practices, electoral college in particular, which was established to maintain remnants of this system. Voter laws, which could see all kinds of efforts to exclude, people of minoritized groups from participating in the franchise. We also see that there was an expectation that Confederate battle flags would no longer be flown. There was also the expectation that the killing of unarmed black men would not take place. And we still see the manifestations of these things in this day and time. There was an expectation of equal citizenship. Of course, there's conversation about what does it mean to be a citizen. well, we know that a slave is not a citizen. Is an ex-slave a citizen? Because at the time that these laws were developed, the Constitution, remember, they were not talking about people of African descent. And so instead we have another iteration in today's hyper-incarceration of people of color, similar politics, similar law enforcement apparatuses in that which establishes neo-slavery of today. We also see the participation of a myriad of companies that are exploiting and take advantage of people while they're in prison, take advantage of their labor. We have heard that there are people that are in prison that are let out to fight forest fires in California for $2 a day. I mean, just to get outside of the prison, they risk their lives for $2 a day to fight forest fires. Interesting. And so, we continue to see targeting of people of color. These are just statistics wherein there's a comparison to lifetime likelihood of imprisonment for U.S. residents by race. And in addition to that, in the land of the free, there are more people in prison per 100,000 than any other country in the world in the land of the free. China, Russia, all the places that we have in our minds been, or perhaps not in our minds, but have been taught to believe are more totalitarian and oppressive in nature than the United States, then how is it in the land of the free? 1 out of every 5 or 4 people that are in jail or prison in the world are incarcerated in the land of the free. And so there are a host of manifestations of this 13th Amendment in today's day. It includes, of course, the shackling of pregnant women in prison during labor and childbirth. Of course, there's been some efforts to undo or develop an anti-shackling law, anti-shackling movement to address this issue, but it primarily comes from the persistent practice attached to black women, in particular through their historical devaluation, to their historical conceptualization of being insignificant as being things. And this is where the practice originates. And so they too are being punished. Their reproductive capacity is being punished. We've seen again wherein there's always, or there not is always, but there's this question to what extent can people control themselves? Oh, so you've seen this before. All right. Well, you know, some things are just too frequent to be coincidental. You know, I know gangs throw signs, and you know, gangs and organizations, there's very little difference between the two because gangs are basically organized people, and we just don't call some gangs gangs, but they throw signs. And then throwing the same signs, if we look at the same policies, we see that it is, or they have been developing furtherance of notions of white supremacy. And we know that notions of white supremacy or notions of whiteness are predicated upon black inferiority. And so the trend continues. And so, more the same, we hear this in our politics today, America first, and the real meaning of that is not new. There was a group, American terrorist group named Ku Klux Klan, who also made that same claim. These are just some of their newspapers that have been tucked in the corner in the library. But they're there. This too is a part of the past. And so among the things that frame my thinking is this framework that I learned at the Silverman School of Social Work. I think I want to give my school a little shout out, even though we're in Columbia. And this particular approach is called the just practice approach. And it's a framework consisting of 5 components, meaning wherein, you know, in every situation we should engage in an examination of what does this actually mean. Because in all the things in our relationships, we assign some type of interpretation, context. We need to see, you know, the situation in context. But we cannot understand context unless we understand the story or the path, which some people frame as history. Because we can't understand where we are unless we understand how did we get there. Finally, we need to understand relationships of power. And this is why we made mention of white supremacy. Because often we don't include in our analysis power dynamics, and finally possibility. I could not be here if we were not hopeful. Among the reasons that we have conditions that remain as they are, because we tell ourselves, this is the way it is, this is the way it's always been, this is the way it always will be. Well, I don't tell myself that. I think what is possible, which is the last of the frameworks, the last of the components. And so, one of the things we hope to have is a discussion about what are we going to do. As we heard, I think one of the people related to the school, we're not here just to identify problems. We've seen this before. We've been, 16, 19 to 2019. That's 400 years, as Hajj Malik said. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. Oh, you remember that? And so, I just want to conclude with, just throwing some questions out about what's possible. What role, what activities, can we engage in to right this terrible wrong that is perpetuated, not just upon, as Flores and Sheena said, it's not just black people. It began with us. But we need to think clearly about issues related to class. Hyper-incarceration brings that to the fore. Class, race, and place, as Sheena also made mention. And with that, I'll bring on a person who I've grown to admire. And I'd like all of us to give Kendall Thomas a round of applause because it's his birthday.